Good morning, I'm Deborah Shipton from Public Health Scotland. Welcome to PHINS 2021 webinar series. PHINS is the Public Health Information Network for Scotland and has been running seminars for over 20 years, organised by the Glasgow Centre for Population Health and Public Health Scotland as part of the ScotFO collaboration. This is the last of 3 webinars in the 2021 series, and we'll be looking at approaches to addressing post-COVID societal inequalities. If you are tweeting, please use the hashtag PHINS2021 or one word. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording along with the slides will be available on the ScotFO website, and you will all receive a link to that in an email later after this. We are now to have 2 20-minute presentations followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat function, and we'll present as many questions as we have time for to the speakers. The first speaker that we have today is Neil McEnroy. He's the Senior Fellow at the Global Advancement for Community Wealth Building at the Democracy Cooperative. He was previously Chief Executive at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, or CLES. He's currently focused on health institutes as an economic anchor, focused on the US and Scotland, where he is the Community Wellbeing Advisor for the Scottish Government. His talk is entitled Community Wealth Equals Good Health, Rewiring an Economy That Works for All. Welcome, Neil. Neil, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Debs. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that okay. See that okay, folks? Give me a yes.
Yeah.
Great,
right.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. I've got 20 minutes here. I'll just put my clock on so I don't overrun. I'm seconding at the moment to the Scottish Government as a community wellbeing advisor, and also work for this organisation called Democracy Cooperative, based in DC, Washington DC in the US. I'm an economist. The joke goes, there's 3 types of economist, one that can count and one that can't. So very much in the kind of behavioural heterodox economics sort of mode. And I've worked quite a lot around health economies and health inequalities over the years. Just as a means of introduction, at this moment in time, all nations face the challenge of an economic transition to new industrial and economic future and prosperity. Social justice, if you like, within ecological limits. And in that, the fundamental sort of basis to this talk today is that existing patterns and system of wealth and power within economy are kind of no longer fit for purpose. And as we say at the Democracy Collaborative, we need to build the kind of next system. And in that, we feel that economies need to be more economically distributed and relate to place, planet, and communities. Now, the intersection between wealth and health, I think, is well known and well talked about. The more money that's in people's pocket, in short, the less likely they are to be ill. So economy is a fundamental determinant, if you like, of ill health. And I think what's interesting about the pandemic is I think it's revealed that connection that we always know to a much greater extent. It's also made us think more about the economy around us, our local services, our local economy, how we relate to each other, the provenance of goods and services, supply chains. I think this connection that's always been there, I think, is becoming more pertinent and more obvious, overt than perhaps it's ever been. And in that, we do need to rewire the economic system to max out on health. The economy, oikonomos, as they say in Greek, the root to the word, is keeper of the household. This is an economy that needs to serve us, serve our people, serve our communities, serve our well-being. The economy is a social construct. It's not a natural science. It's a social construct, and we need to make sure we construct an economy that truly works for us. Now, in that, I think we need to think about this connection and how we unlock wealth and health. And we know healthier workers are more productive. Healthier children learn and attain more, potentially be more productive when they come to adult life. Higher incomes permit better nutrition and wealth, and having a genuine stake in power in the economy is well-being producing. If you feel you're in control of your economic destiny to some extent, yeah, that makes you feel better about yourself. So there's a clear connective tissue here that we need to work through in building this next system and an economy that works for all. Now, this diagram here basically says that prevention is better than cure. The institutional response, as soon as somebody gets that ill, yeah, and has to go into a health institution, it costs a lot more. We need to make sure we're creating a societal context, an economic context, that means that less people are ill and having to make that institutional response. This goes right back to the Christie Commission, yeah, that says that we need to work to create a better society and a better economy, which in sense is a public sector reform agenda, which is a reducing demand on public services agenda. Now, at the heart of this rewiring is the question of wealth. Wealth is a defining feature of all economies. Who has it? Where does it go? And how do more people get their hands on it is fundamentally important for how we think about our economy and how we rewire for health. The goal then, the goal is to create an economy where wealth is broadly held, not narrowly held, broadly held, locally rooted in our communities, rooted in our homes, rooted in our households. So financial resources are recirculated locally. This is, if you think about wealth, is a flow of, say, like water. It's a nourishing force, and we need to have a hydrological system, an ecosystem of wealth that means it truly nurtures and sustains people in a decent way. And that is how we build well-being, and that is how we improve health. To make the shifts we need to make here, we could assume that it's a linear progression, a steady onward march of making improvements. Arguably, because of the context we are in terms of the pandemic, climate crisis, this is no longer a linear path. We need to actually make a paradigm shift. The linear path is actually a bit of a doom loop. We actually need to be more fundamental and braver, more radical in making a lift, to make a break out of a linear progression. We'll just make things a bit better and make quite a quantum leap to create a new system altogether. This is the radical edge of my own organisation, Democracy Collaborative. But clearly, we all need to find that radical feeling in our own activities so we can start to make that bigger quantum shift, that paradigm shift. Now, if you think about wealth, never before in human history has wealth been so concentrated in the hands of the few. 8 of the richest men, just think about this, 8 of the richest men, if they were to realise all their assets, would have the same wealth as half the population of the world. This is unprecedented in human history, this concentration of wealth. In Scotland, 10% of Scots own 44% of all wealth. In Scotland, 1% own more wealth than the bottom 50%. We have this concentration of wealth, which is a fundamental malfunctioning of the economy, because those that don't have the wealth are struggling. There's a social pain, there's difficulties, that leads to lack of well-being and leads to ill health. It leads to demand on our public services. This is common sense ideas around wealth and health, and that's how we need to make the shift. Another way to think about this is to think about wealth or community wealth, the project that I was going to talk about, is about economic plummet. If we think about flows of wealth going through pipes, we need to think about how we're making sure that more of that wealth is redirected to communities and to our people, that it's not leaking away. If you think about huge investments in our fine cities, where does all that wealth go? Who are the shareholders? Who are the investors? Where are those investors? Are they paying tax? Are they in tax havens? These are fundamental questions as regarding these flows of wealth and who actually benefits. And we need to rewire the system, replumb the system to ensure that more of wealth lands in to the people who produce the wealth in the first place, or where that wealth geographically is actually being created. Now, in community wealth building, we think about these pillars of wealth in 5 different ways. Now, I'm not going to go into this a lot of detail, and there's more stuff I could talk about this forever, really. But in essence, there's 5 different ways we think about wealth. 1, financial wealth, a financial ecosystem that nourishes our people and our communities. Workforce, fair work agenda we have in Scotland, fantastic agenda. How do we make sure we get more wealth back into people's pockets, and also there's dignity and decency in work? Spending, public spending, 35% of the whole Scottish economy roughly is based upon our public spending, redistributive wealth, if you like. Where does that go? What are our big anchor institutions spend? Where are they purchasing their resource? Who are their suppliers? Land and property, huge amount of wealth held in land and property. Again, who owns that wealth, and how do we make sure it nourishes our people and our communities? And all adding up, if you like, to this question of ownership. The way that we give more breadth to wealth, the way that we make it more, the way that we have more of a flow of wealth more effectively is to think about ownership of land, property, economic activity, not in the hands of a narrow band of men, that is broadly owned across our society. The great places of the world, the great resilient places of the world, have a diverse portfolio of ownership models within the economy. Now, in Scotland, where I'm working 2 days a week with the Scottish Government, the Local Economy Division and the Economic Development Directorate, we are advancing on this community wealth building approach. It's a maturing of economic development, and it's a means, the practical means by which we deliver on Scotland's well-being and inclusive growth aspirations. Traditionally, and this is where the leap, the change comes in here. Traditionally, we're focused in economies and in Scotland on redistribution of wealth. This is about, we get the growth and then we transfer payments, regeneration, welfare system, public spending, we redistribute it to poorer people. That's fine, we need more of that. But what community wealth building thinks about is pre-distribution. This is actually thinking, what about when economic activity actually takes place before the growth? How do we make sure that more people have a stake in that? Pre-distribution, during and before. This is the real game here, opposed to just waiting until we get the growth and then redistributing it to poorer people. We're saying, hold on, how do we make poor people actually have more of a dibs and stake in it, in the actual production of the economic activity and that growth itself? And this is where ownership is key. Cooperatives, other forms of ownership models are fundamentally important, because that means you're not just getting wealth from wages, you're getting wealth by actually owning more of that productive activity. So in Scotland, there's 4 unconnected elements to this community wealth building agenda. Firstly, there's policy, and there's many touch points in Scottish Government of community wealth with different forms of policy areas. I mentioned some before: land reform, employee ownership, procurement, sustainable procurement policy, fair work. So making touch points with other policy areas. The second bit has been practice. So very much, I'm just looking at my time here, hold on. I'm fine. Second is practice. This is where advancing community wealth building in place and in institutions. There's 6 localities in Scotland that now have community wealth building action plans, including North Ayrshire and Clackmannanshire and Fife. 3, there's a number of others. And this is about actually practice on the ground, working through those 5 pillars that I talked about and seeing what we can turn the dial on in terms of redirecting and rewiring the flow of wealth. Movement building, there's growing awareness interest across Scotland, and I have to say Public Health Scotland and other players within the health community have been very, very supportive of this agenda and pushing on in their own toot, if you like, which is great. So movement building, growing awareness and understanding, and this today is part of that, for people to get interested in this agenda. And then in the SNP manifesto and now in the programme for government, there's probable legislation for community wealth building later on in this parliamentary term. And we inside the Scottish Government are muscling up now in terms of staffing and so forth to lead up to that legislation, as well as doing all the other work we've got to do as part of this agenda. Now, what's really important, I think, for community wealth building is this talk about anchor institutions, and health boards, health organisations are key anchors. Fundamentally, you buy stuff, yeah, so spending, one of those pipes, one of those flows. You own land and property assets, one of those pipes, one of those flows, and you employ people. Employ people, buy stuff, and you have land and property assets. That's an important lever you have as an economic agent to affect change within the economy. Your primary job, your one lens of your spectacles is focusing on delivering what you've got to deliver. I would argue the other lens, I think we're an economic agent. How are we actually supporting the wider economic determinants of our health by our very institutions and what we purchase, who we employ, and what we do with our land and property assets? A little bit about the heritage of this, I suppose, this kind of thinking within the United Kingdom. We did when I was in the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, we did a very influential report with the Health Foundation called Health Institutions Anchors. I can't remember it was done there, I think it was 2017 or 18. And that fed into what was the NHS in England long-term plan, where it was a fairly large clause section in that report, in that plan, actually talked about for the first time as the role of the NHS as an anchor institution, as an economic agent. Almost going back, though it wasn't explicitly in the report, going back to the founding nature of the NHS in terms of these edifices in places were a beacon of well-being. They said, we are looking after the people in an institutional sense, which I think goes back, harks back partly to the foundation of the NHS. And obviously we have this great report from the Health Foundation that was perhaps spawned from the original work about how we see the NHS as an anchor institution. So health boards in Scotland, I think, are considerable anchor organisations, and they're part now of some of the community wealth building anchor work collectively being done across community planning partnerships in Scotland, including Fife and in North Ayrshire, to name two that are doing really well on this. Let me just, now there is a warning around all this, which it's the pitfall that health as anchors is not just a new partnership. It's a focused, action focused to think about their role as economic agents. It's about that role as an employer, as a purchaser, as a land and property holder, and how can you turn the dial on that? And I think it's important that it's about those economic determinants you're thinking about here, rather than just another piece of governance, another partnership to talk about what we're all doing. It's very much focused on this role as economic agents. We see it from an economist point of view. I want to know, of course, health outcomes are so important, and what you do in service terms are so important, but in economic terms, interest in this economic agent role of the health institutions. Now, there's many examples across Scotland going on and across the world, if you like. Now, the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry in Cleveland, Ohio. What happened here was, just an example, the hospital, very poor part of America, Rust Belt, desperate actually in many ways. What happened there is that there's a sense, what we're going to do if people don't have jobs? Huge unemployment, what do we do? And the hospital, as one part of an anchor institution, said, look, we send our laundry all across America to get washed, and it comes back to us. Why don't we set up some kind of co-op And they set up the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry, which is now a huge entity, which services not only the hospital, but hotels and other institutions in Cleveland and beyond. So this is about actually that economic agent role being seen by the hospital to think, hold on, what can we do to actually create something in the economy? And they ended up setting up a co-op. There's other examples there that I probably don't have time to touch upon, but all of those institutions in some way are either looking at their land or looking at their workforce policy or looking at their procurement policies in terms of how they're turning the dial. It's interesting just the Hywel Dda Health Board in South Wales. They need to recruit 2,000 people, cleaners to porters to healthcare workers, and they're targeting specifically local people, but also areas of high deprivation across that part of Wales. So that's the kind of thinking there. I won't go into it in detail because of time, but there's stuff there. In terms of community wealth building role of anchors, the Scottish Government has some great policies that support this. And there is this action planning work happening, as I mentioned, in those localities. And there is also a Health as Anchors working group that Public Health Scotland run, Michael Kellett chairs, which is important in terms of developing and animating this movement. I hope that's okay. I think I'm just about on time. Thanks very much for listening. I'm looking forward to any of your questions. It was a bit of a canter through, but you'll get the slides. And I hope you've got some great questions for me. Thank you very much for listening for now. Stop the share.
Thanks, Neil. Thank you very much for that. As Neil said, we'll have a discussion after Kathryn. So if you could use the Q&A to do that. So now we'll march on to Kathryn Pierce, who has 15 years experience working on international climate and energy policy, building intergenerational justice and long-term approaches to key decisions. She was involved in the Wellbeing of Futures Generation Act in Wales. She is the Innovation Manager at Sniffer and is currently working with Glasgow City Region on their response to climate change. She's going to be talking to us today about flourishing in our future climate, building justice and inclusive resilience in the face of climate change. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thanks very much, Debs, and good morning to everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks to Neil for a really great presentation. That's a hard act to follow, I have to say. I'm just going to share my screen, so just bear with me a second. Bring that up onto slideshow. Taking a while. There we go. Great morning, everybody. Just a little bit about Climate Ready Clyde. I work with Sniffer and we provide the technical secretariat for Climate Ready Clyde, and we are the leading climate adaptation initiative to build climate resilience across Glasgow City Region. We have 15 member organisations and we're supported by the Scottish Government. Just a little bit of detail perhaps on the background about Glasgow City Region, since this is the region that Climate Ready Clyde is focusing on. We're a third of Scotland's economic activity, a third of Scotland's population, with a diverse mix of sort of urban and rural areas. And just a little bit of the detail around the demographics and climate change. And a lot of these figures are very helpfully provided in the Health in a Changing City report. The population of the region is growing and aging. There's greater women living in the region than men. And the ethnic makeup of the region is more diverse than average, but levels of diversity vary significantly across the region. And levels of health and overall deprivation really vary significantly across the region, with Inverclyde and Glasgow City the most deprived, East Renfrewshire and East Dunbartonshire the least deprived, and there are increasing numbers of private renting tenants, often in poor conditions of housing, and a significant number of homes in fuel poverty. Observations show Glasgow City Region's temperatures and rainfall are increasing. Over the last few decades, Scotland has experienced a warming trend with shifting rainfall patterns. Scotland's 10 warmest years on record have all occurred since 1997. And there's been an increase in rainfall over Scotland in the past few decades, with an increasing proportion of rainfall coming from heavy rainfall events, heavy rainfall downpours. Future flooding is an area that we are focusing on for Climate Ready Clyde, and this will have large distributional differences with impacts higher for deprived neighbourhoods and those groups which have lower resilience. Glasgow and the wider city region have some of the highest levels of social vulnerability to flooding relative to the rest of the UK, suggesting that if not addressed proactively, populations in the city region could be more negatively affected than other groups around the UK. And a number of UK studies show that women are more likely than men to experience poor mental health after severe flooding events. The city region's already beginning to make headway in considering just and inclusive adaptation issues in relation to flooding, but more needs to be done to identify distributions of vulnerable groups, ensure the involvement of communities in developing and delivering adaptation responses, and really being aware of the trade-offs that can arise in addressing social vulnerability. And SEPA's second national flood risk assessment has explicitly considered social and economic vulnerability as part of classifying and prioritising areas of flood risk. The increased costs of mortality and morbidity from heat extremes in the longer term are more likely also to affect vulnerable groups such as elderly, those with existing health conditions, and those in socially deprived areas due to a combination of that exposure and vulnerability. The reduced costs of heating buildings will have positive distributional benefits, benefiting those on lower incomes the most, and also helping to reduce fuel poverty. It was back in 2018, Climate Ready Clyde completed a detailed climate risk and opportunity assessment to understand what this would mean for Glasgow City Region's economy, society and environment in the short and longer term. And these were used to inform the development of the adaptation strategy and action plan, which I'll come on to. The assessment identified 67 risks and opportunities. It's likely that these will disproportionately affect particular groups, including older people who are at greater risk of health impacts from extreme heat and cold, socially or economically disadvantaged communities, as they tend to live in places which are more exposed to climate impacts, have more underlying vulnerabilities and more limited means to respond. Young people or those with disabilities who have limited capacity to act or rely on others to help manage those risks, and tenants who are less able to adapt their homes than owner-occupiers in order to prepare for and recover from climate events. What do we mean by opportunities here? So an example would be the role of quality green space in delivering climate benefits as well as enhanced health and well-being. The risk and opportunity assessment also included a dedicated consideration of risks and opportunities to social justice and inequalities from climate change and adaptation responses. Whilst the review found some key issues, in general, there was limited evidence of social justice implications of climate change being considered in adaptation planning within Glasgow City Region beyond the standard flood risk management cycle. There were 10 areas where further action is needed over the next 5 years, and those are those 10 priority areas in front of you. We also identified 4 particular categories where more action was needed. Sorry, my barking dog is delighted that the postman has arrived. Those 4 categories, firstly, infrastructure, economy, business and industry, society and health, and then thirdly, on the natural environment. And it was that climate risk and opportunity assessment which helped to inform Glasgow City Region's climate adaptation strategy and action plan, which Climate Ready Clyde led on its development and engagement across Glasgow City Region, and extensive kind of evidence to sort of inform that climate strategy and action plan. It's a high ambition strategy and aimed at that real transformation of how we can ensure that our region and all those living in the region flourish in our future climate, to systematically transform our economy, society, and natural environment to one which flourishes in a future climate within a decade. It's been recognised by the Independent UK Committee on Climate Change as one of the leading examples in the UK of how to address and respond to climate risks. It contains some hard choices now, but means that we avoid harder ones in the future, and really requires a step change and a new approach to be systems focused, inclusive, collaborative, innovative, and transformative. And it means new governance is required, with changes for oversight, delivery, ownership and agency, and with new funding is required, using public funds strategically, but really unlocking private sector investment, which is so far absent from the adaptation agenda, not just for Glasgow City Region, but more widely. So what do we mean by, when we talk about transformational adaptation? This is really taking us beyond the sort of the standard business as usual kind of incremental adaptation of the past and to date, but really to take us to a transformational scale of adaptation. And this is a definition that comes from our work last year, Clyde Rebuilt, which was funded by EIT Climate Kick, the EU's climate innovation hub. And that definition there sets out our understanding of what we mean by transformational adaptation. It involves changing existing approaches, altering governance arrangements, and addressing underlying causes of climate risk or vulnerability. It may also involve rethinking the future vision of the region, including the societal, cultural, institutional, ecological, and physical changes needed, as well as the region's political economy. And transformational approaches call for systems thinking and socio-institutional analysis, and offer the potential to deliver a larger, more sustainable, permanent, long-term change. The adaptation strategy and action plan was also supported by a social impact assessment to support just and inclusive adaptation. The strategy actively seeks to create a more fair, just and inclusive city region as part of the adaptation process. And so the Climate Ready Clyde Secretariat undertook a social impact assessment in parallel to development of the main strategy last year. And this really was a voluntary assessment and was designed to reflect duties under the Equality Act 2010, but also to consider sort of broader social issues associated with climate change in Glasgow City Region, to ensure as far as possible that the strategy interventions don't worsen existing inequalities associated with climate change, to inform content of the final strategy by providing recommendations so that the interventions can build a more just, inclusive city region, and to provide an approach to considering the strategy interventions that's transparent, participatory and inclusive, with the intention of opening up a process to strengthen opportunities for wider voices to be heard in adaptation in Glasgow City Region. And this is just one example of how the work that we did in that social impact assessment helped to inform the development and understanding within the strategy. And this is just one example of how the ideas from various workshops and conversations helped to inform one of our particular interventions that I will go on to. So the strategy itself contains a vision. It's based on a vision to 2050, one that Glasgow City Region that flourishes in a future climate. It contains a strategy to 2030 with 11 interventions and 42 sub-interventions, and is also containing an action plan to 2025 with 16 flagship actions. And these are the 11 interventions contained within the strategy. And these are set out according to a range of ambition and scale, starting on the x-axis, on the horizontal there, looking at sort of narrow framing of adaptation, through to combining with net zero to be reducing emissions, and then through to sustainable development, to the wider sort of co-benefits of our adaptation measures. And then on the y-axis, on the vertical, looking at where we are working currently at an incremental nature of our adaptation measures, to how we can be scaling up to take us through to a transition and take us through to that transformational adaptation, that far-reaching scale that brings those sort of wider co-benefits, but also addresses that systemic challenges and structural challenges that we are facing. And these are the 16 flagship actions, and they're set out according to the nature of the sectors and organizations that are part and parcel in delivering of those 16 flagship actions. And this really leads to the nature of that collaboration and inclusivity that the adaptation strategy and action plan is searching for and reaching for, that opportunity for all organizations, for all actors across Glasgow City region, really to step up and engage and contribute to the nature of the scale and the challenge that we have to build a broader sort of climate resilience in the region. I don't have time to go through all of those 16 flagship actions in detail one by one, but just to touch on just very briefly one of those 16 flagship actions, which is the Clyde Climate Forest. And many of you may be familiar with this particular example. It has a focus on 3 elements. So the first is on the canopy, with opportunities to increase canopy cover through new tree planting, particularly in areas of deprivation and at risk from the impacts of climate change. The second is on connectivity, where new woodland planting will make connections that provide potential migration routes for woodland species. And the third is on carbon, where woodland creation will deliver good sequestration opportunities. And it seeks to address climate risk in urban areas through the management of rain and surface water during heavy rainstorms, and reducing overheating through transpiration and shading during more frequent heat waves to come, and addressing climate risk in rural areas through providing natural flood management to reduce downstream fluvial flooding. Some climate impacts, such as storms and extreme rainfall, will have effects across the entire of Glasgow City region. However, others are more geographically specific. So in support of the strategy's interventions, we've identified a number of priority areas and locations within Glasgow City region. Whilst place-based approaches are crucial across Glasgow City region, we identified a set of place-based priority areas that are regionally and nationally significant for adaptation. These are areas where there are one or more of the following conditions. Current and future climate hazards are most acute. There is a potential to affect disproportionately vulnerable communities, or that there are significant concentrations of economic assets and where significant regional decisions are being taken in relation to new development. Defining place-based priorities helps provide a focus for where some of our interventions should take place on the ground, and should be seen in the context of and connected to the broader climate resilience of Glasgow City region overall. And the criteria used to define the areas are set out in the table on the right that you have there. A key theme across the adaptation strategy is also a focus on achieving just resilience. And this again points out the acknowledgement of social economic inequalities created by climate impacts and people's varying ability to deal with them, and recognises that social and economic factors affect how people are impacted by climate change. The interventions seek to address this and ensure the benefits of the region's adaptation are widely and equitably shared, and ensure adaptation itself doesn't increase vulnerability or exacerbate existing inequalities. And the action plan includes 3 stretch targets, so that by 2025, we'll have increased the resilience of over 140,000 of the region's most vulnerable people to the impact of climate change. And that target of supporting the most vulnerable is aligned to the UN's Race to Resilience campaign, which Climate Ready Clyde is a member, and which will build a resilience of 4 billion of the world's most vulnerable people to the impacts of climate change. The second target is, stretch target, is closing the region's adaptation finance gap of £184 million a year. And the third target is to involve 125 new organisations, community groups and businesses supporting the region to adapt. Unlike other regions in Europe, Glasgow City Region has no clear mandated responsibility for delivering on adaptation. So to support its implementation, Climate Ready Clyde's board and our member organisations will seek to take the lead, supporting and enabling communities, businesses and institutions to play a role in delivering the strategy by fostering that ambitious adaptive culture, to coordinate and activate institutions, communities and business, to really drive and deliver innovation, and finally to sort of enable and equip that action and ensure that we can all play our part. And I think I shall leave it there. I think I'm just okay for time, but many thanks for your attention. The link there is to the Adaptation Strategy and Action Plan on our website, and I look forward to the discussion and questions. Thanks, Debs, over to you.
Thanks, Kathryn. Thank you very much for that. So we're now going to go on to the question and answer section. We have some questions already in the chat. If you want to ask any more, please do so, and we will hopefully get to them. So the first one is to Neil, and I think from Sue Atkinson. So she's looking for if there are examples of finance people, finance directors, etc., who've understood and got this agenda via anchors to help. I guess it's sort of like good practice. It's someone who's got it already, maybe that you know in Scotland, that people could maybe mine their sort of experience. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I believe it's a growing movement, and many finance directors are seeing the potential, particularly around the procurement side of things, as well as the investment side of things, in terms of how they use their own resources, pension funds and so forth, and how that is utilised for local investments, but also wider zero carbon questions. So in terms of examples, I imagine there's many. I don't have any at hand. I mean, I know recently I spoke to somebody at Barts and Bartholomew Hospital, and that's in England, and very much a progressive finance director who got all this and seen the potential in terms of how they turn the dial. But yeah, sorry, I'm not being specific enough or granular enough, but I'm sure that other people in the call will probably have lots of examples apart from me. But I think it's a growing cognizance, though we've got a long way to go until it becomes mainstream, this sort of thinking in our finance directors.
I'll actually just jump to another question around that, because I think people are in Scotland and probably elsewhere wanting to do it, but sort of finding blockers, I guess. So that was that question's about. And I guess you mentioned about the Community Wealth Building Act. So I know procurement, there's a lot of potential there, and folk, particularly in the NHS, are really struggling with it. And so, and the sort of the sense of constraints that there are regulatory around that. And Sakit Pradashi has also mentioned about, raised this, who's in the NHS, about the competitive process and how it's difficult to prioritise other things other than value for money. Do you, in the Community Wealth Building Act, are you thinking that is something that can address some of this? And also a second part of that question, what else do you think should be in the Community Wealth Building Act that could facilitate local partners to deliver this more easily?
I put my civil service hat in terms of like just watching, we're early days in terms of looking at what will be contained within the Act. And that does include a look at existing legislation and policy that may need to be changed or tweaked to advance community wealth building. And that does in part relate to procurement, though I would say the sustainable procurement activity in Scotland is actually really, really good. In fact, world leading, I think. The question here is whether that's about the something in the regulations on the legislation, or whether it's something about practice. I think there's some more we can do in terms of practice. So we just need to look at the whole round of what would amplify, scale and accelerate a community wealth building approach. And certainly we will be looking at that as part of any act that needs to come forward. Though I think it is an important caveat that we need to look at, like, well, is this a risk averse nature, but the legislation is okay? Is it something embedded in practice rather than legislation itself? We've got to be very careful with legislation. It's like, it's seen as like everything. I think, it's got to be additive and it's got to be clearly focused. And I think that is very much in the back of our minds when we walk through the process of developing the bill, which will be later on in the parliamentary term.
Thank you. And Kathryn, you'd mentioned just saying quite practical that the sort of new governance arrangements are required. Could you say a bit more about that, so we can have a greater understanding of what it is you're thinking that we need?
Thanks, Debs. I think it essentially means how we're making our decisions, really, in terms of ensuring that sort of greater participation of individuals, communities, so that they are able to make decisions about what affects their local, their localities, their neighbourhoods, by doing so, it helps to ensure that those types of solutions and the ideas that they come up with are more likely to be more relevant to their needs, and to the challenges that they're facing. But they're more likely to be sort of longer lasting as well, more effective, because they are actually directly sort of relevant to, to sort of local needs and those local challenges I mentioned. But, it's also about the sort of very sort of top-down heavy somehow some of the agencies currently sort of operate. Scotland and Glasgow City region is very centralised in how it makes its decisions and how the sort of public agencies are sort of currently operating at the moment. How can we ensure that there is perhaps a bit more sort of a decentralised ability for informed participatory decision making that is really sort of meaningful? But there's more sort of transparency also in terms of how some of those decisions are being made. When we talk about sort of thinking about governance, I mean, it's a very, very broad term, and adaptation in terms of its meaning and sense is often being regarded very narrowly in terms of, just very sort of narrow framing of adaptation. And through sort of expanding the sort of sense of what we mean by adaptation, by opening up that frame into sort of broader resilience, it means that the kind of governance arrangements around that sort of have to step out of their silos that they're currently sort of operating in. So there is a sort of cross-departmental process by which decisions are made. And the climate adaptation is not regarded narrowly just in terms of climate change or indeed just solely on environment, but also brings out that sort of social aspect to it and incorporates a bit more of a holistic, balanced view to how we are working on those solutions.
So do you think that would require soft changes in the sort of governance, or do we need changes at the formal sort of decision-making structures, so you have different people in those structures?
I think it's all of the above, to be honest. So I think this has to happen from many different aspects. I mean, there's, as most of us have seen, there's an increased interest and pursuit of sort of climate assemblies, citizens' assemblies. That is one example of how we can sort of decentralize and take more of a sort of bottom-up approach to our governance and decision making. But I think it also has to be from the sort of top down too. And this is where it comes down to sort of the sort of innovation, really, about how innovation doesn't have to be about technical solutions. It's also about social innovation, about how we are working together, whether that be a legislative framework and how, top down sort of policies and regulations are operating, but also bottom up too.
Thank you very much. So I guess you're discussing issues of power there, so it brings me nicely onto a question from Rebecca Campbell about reaching the sort of aspirations that you've both spoken about here. And we do know that by and large what both of you are asking for is going to take away power and resources away from the rich and powerful. It is just going to do that. So a word on practically how would we address that elephant in the room around acknowledging that where power and resources are going to have to shift in order to achieve that. Maybe I'll start with Neil.
It's a really good question, Rebecca, and it's a fundamental one. And I think, we're in a linear process, but I think there has to be a paradigm shift in this. The speed, flow, and benefits of capitalism and the shareholder supremacy needs to be disrupted. That's a fundamental to this, and that needs to be taken on. I mean, I think September 2019, the Financial Times said something like capitalism needs a reset. It needs resetting, if not more. There's no doubt about that. And in practical terms, what we need to think about here is shortening supply chains. We can't have that hyper mobility of, like, buying a pack of Monge 2 that's from Guatemala in our supermarket. This is not on. So shortening supply chains, and it's a key part of community wealth building. Making our local economy more servicing us. That's urban food growing. It's local independence. It's that whole relational aspect of the economy is so fundamental, and making it more intimate is a fundamental basis to reshaping of capitalism, reshaping of our economy. Land ownership. Our land is the commons. It's our land. And we need to own that. And any economic activity that takes place upon it, we should have more dibs in that. It should be recirculated. And that, again, slows down that hyper fossil-fueled, almost steroidal nature of the global economy. Financial ecosystems need to be nourishing and support us and support our own local endeavour, our own ingenuity, our own creativity, our own craft, rather than land and property appreciation and agglomeration in our city centres. There's a whole range of things that community wealth building touch upon that are all starting to turn the dial on this. So it's a great question. It's fundamental. And we do need to reshape and reset that economic model and be brave. Otherwise, there's no alternative. There is no alternative to this.
Thanks, Neil. Kathryn, do you have a comment on that?
I agree with Neil. Those points he's just made are completely spot on. And also, Rebecca, I agree. It's a really important question here, and a challenge. I would perhaps give an example of this, in where this sort of direction and trend is moving, and it's coming from many different angles. But just one example is this, looking at 20-minute neighbourhoods. Now, this is a phrase and a sort of general campaign that's being bandied around in various places, but if that kind of concept could work in practice, that's really playing out in the reality of everything that Neil has just sort of mentioned, is about bringing that down to scale, breaking that sort of sense of sort of the, global kind of, supply chains that we rely upon. But it makes us interact with our localities in this very, very different way. It makes us think, makes us think very differently. So that the concept of 20-minute neighborhoods is quite simple, but if it plays out in practice, it really changes how we think about our realities around us, how we connect, the decisions that we're making, those power structures and power dynamics, where those leverages of change are, how we can influence our world around us.
Thanks a lot. Look, thinking again back to the community wealth building, so it's going to be a long-term endeavour, obviously. So is there any plans around evaluation in terms of what's working, what's not, in order to, in the sort of the time it's going to take for this to shift, that we can see how we're impacting on retaining wealth locally? So I guess to Neil.
I would argue it's not long term. This is about this is about doing things every day. This is practical now. This is not dreaming up a well-being economy that's going to happen sometime down there. This is happening now in Scotland. Community wealth building is happening now. People are doing things every single day. It's not long term. It's scaling up and amplifying, yeah, and getting the tipping point might be somewhere down the line. But actually it's happening, and we need to have more and more of that. And there is plans afoot in the Scottish Government in terms of measurement and evaluation of what we're doing, community wealth building. It's all there. The measurement's important, well-being, economy measures important. But one important message here is the kind of moment we're in. I'm a big fan of a guy called Roberto Ungar. He's a Brazilian philosopher and politician. Radical social innovation. Roberto tells us that the moment we're in, right, the moment we're in is we need to experiment and collaborate like mad. Yeah, small things perhaps that can grow up, build up, because they foreshadow, he says, the bigger change. They're epiphanies of possibilities, is what he says. There's a moment like, that's what the new future looks like. The more and more we have of that, whether it's whether it's community owning land, putting on housing, building wind turbines in the Western Isles, whether it's Kinnan Park Complex, whether it's people doing some progressive stuff in procurement in Clackmannanshire Council. These are epiphanies of possibilities of how we build a well-being economy and how we create a better future. We just need more and more and more of them. So measurement's important, but I'm picking up the long term. This is not long term. It's right now. We're turning the dial now.
Thanks, Neil. So, Kathryn, you mentioned in one of your things about systems thinking, and I know there's an awful lot of misunderstanding of what that is. I wonder if it'd be useful in the context of what you were saying, what does that mean in practice when you say we need a systems thinking to address the issues you were talking about?
Some system thinking thinks that you've got to look at the whole, sorry, was it me or for Dick?
Well, sorry, I was just, you can come in after, I was just asking Kathryn, sorry.
No, I'm happy for Neil to go and I'll follow up. Go on, Neil.
Yeah, there's one school of thought in system thinking that basically it's a recipe for procrastination, because what it does is you've got to look at the whole system. And unless all the different bits are changing, then you can't, so it becomes a research exercise. It becomes an academic exercise. System thinking, system change that I believe in, and I think is essential to this, is actually you get one part of the system and you change that and you get it working really, really well. And as it works really well, you'll see how it's actually, oh, it could go even better if we change that bit of the system. So it's actually more it's snowbally. It's taking a bit of the system, like say procurement system. So you look at procurement, that affects supply chains. It affects what form of contractors are potentially bidding. It affects how the institution thinks about itself. Yeah, so that's how we've got this community wealth building, very focused on these 5 pillars, very focused on doing stuff, which eventually will set to infect and change the whole system, but we're not there yet. And that is what my organisation, Democracy Collaborative, talk about in the next system, and that's our work in the States and elsewhere in the world. It's very much practical, getting on and doing it. In Scotland, there's a lot of talk about the well-being economy, and yeah, and I'm all for it. But what are we going to do on Monday is the key system change question. Not let's look at the whole system, try and what are we going to do on Monday, and let's go on and do it. And let's make that an epiphany of possibility and foreshadowing the bigger system, whole system change.
Thanks, Neil. So we're at 11, but I want to hear from Kathryn around the understanding of systems change before we leave.
Thanks, Debs. Systems thinking is certainly not about procrastination. That's really not the intention here. There's a risk, obviously, when you start thinking about systems thinking that requires sort of further research. What does that mean? What does that mean? We are taking, by that approach, really taking a very sort of action-oriented now sort of interpretation of how we sort of work within our system and sort of recognizing what that means and what that looks like. I agree with Neil, we have to start somewhere, but systems thinking for us and for me is about seeing the interconnections at play, seeing where the catalysts and levers of influence and change are possible, but also recognizing that if we act in one space over here, there's going to be consequences, unintended or not, in another area of the system. So how do you ensure that the activities that we work on and really approach, that it has that sort of bigger, stronger impact, and recognizing it's recognizing a point I just made just now about that sort of silo working and silo thinking that is so ingrained, and it has held back so much of the innovation and the change and the transformation that's required. By looking at it from a systems approach, starting somewhere, is where we need to be, and we need to start now, but it's really seeing how we sit in that system, what is holding us back, whether it be, a particular individual or an organization or an agency or business, is where they sit in that system and the powers and influence that they have to be able to create that more significant, profound kind of change that we require.
Lovely, thanks a lot. Well, I'm at 11, so I want to say thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much to all those that dialed in and asked questions. There's particular ones, Bella K and Katie Riki asked specific questions, so we can get back to you after this. So just remains to say thank you very much to the speakers, to GCPH for organising it, and to those that have come to listen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Debs. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Debs. Thanks, Kathryn.